Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman, and I am your host. My guest today is Stephen Dolinski, Dr. Stephen Dolinski.
That is correct.
Stephen Dolinski is a board-certified psychiatrist. He has treated patients with a plethora of different life circumstances and diagnoses, ranging from multiple forms of post-traumatic illness, mild to severe mood disorders, including bipolar disorder, all forms of anxiety, OCD, other obsessive disorders, various substance use disorders, to psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. So the conversation today really is about school shootings and where does psychiatry or could psychiatry fit in there? Welcome.
Thank you, Natasha.
And it's not even school shootings, it's mass shootings. So you and I have had a conversation before by phone.
Have, yes.
So, I certainly have my opinions about where that belongs or doesn't belong, but I'd love to hear your point of view.
Well, it's very, very disturbing, obviously, what we're seeing today. I remember growing up and being in high school still, and I'm sure you probably had a similar experience that this just didn't happen. So when we go onto the news and we see such frequency of these events, and not only frequency but amplitude of events, especially since the late 90s, it's very concerning because I feel for the students going to school these days because they shouldn't even have to have it in their mind that something violent could happen. The most violent thing that happened when I was growing up is if you were dealing with bullies and you got into a fight of some sort and nobody died. And that has really changed a great deal. So when I had the opportunity to speak with you, it was intriguing to me because I feel that there hasn't been enough conversation about multiple aspects that I think have led to the problem. And it's not just mental health, but it's obvious, I think, to most people that mental health and mental health treatment, diagnosis, identification of the problems that might lead to this are one of the important factors in hopefully us being able to find some way or conduit to progress in this area.
Yeah, there are so many issues that we could take a look at, the opioid epidemic. And again, as human beings, we tend to look for quick solutions because we want to fix the problem.
That's exactly right.
But the solutions are very complex. It's not just, doesn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
Nothing happens in a vacuum. So it happens inside of a society. So the whole issue of, and I've done some reading about this, the whole issue of mental health predictability, that some mental health professional can predict behavior. There's no evidence really to support that.
True.
And the quick step to, I think there's a place for it, but the quick step to it really starts to stigmatize any kind of mental health issues. And statistically, 4% of violent crimes are committed by mental health, who have been diagnosed as mentally health and, with mental health illness and violence. But people who are mentally ill are 65% more likely to be abused by the public, by the police. So if we're looking at, how do we fix this? Where's the role of mental health in there? We also have to look at the mental health of the law enforcement, the mental health of the teachers. Who's setting up these the rules, the game plan.
Sure. And
in the Florida school shooting, there were all sorts of signs along the way, and
they were reported.
And reported. So, do we need more reporting? I think not. And today I was talking to someone who said that they're talking about an nationwide psychiatric database. Oh my God, where do we go with that?
The NRA was speaking about that, yes.
That's insane.
Yes, and reminiscent of control programs from the past. Yes. Yeah.
And there was a shooter in Las Vegas who had no signs of mental illness. He was successful in life. He, again, from our point of view, you have to be crazy, okay, but and there's crazy inside the context of that's not sane behavior.
Sure.
But there would have been no way to predict what he did. So what do we do about all of that? And where can we see a role for psychiatry, mental health professionals that isn't narrow and, oh, we can predict? Nobody can predict.
This is true. And I think it goes beyond diagnoses. Sometimes when we talk about mental health, we limit it to simply what can be diagnosable and tracked. When we talk about people, we're so much more complex than that. So one piece that I think figures in very strongly with this, and I don't think has gotten enough press, although we were talking about it when we talked earlier, the idea of empathy, and how even though you cannot diagnose someone with empathy problems, it does factor into several diagnoses that do exist. But everybody I meet with, and people I know who I don't meet with, who are family members, friends, we all have a different level of empathy. The amount of time and effort and ability we have to consider the needs and feelings of others, and how we can factor that into decisions and behaviors. When we take a look at that issue, we then can see where, if that has gone down, which I would propose that it has gone down over the decades in our society, we can have a discussion of that. I think it opens up the door for violence where there would not have been violence in the past. Kids today, I again get back to the idea that it's different these days. You can be exposed to violence in so many different ways. You can look at the news. You can look at video games. You can listen to music. You can also sort of appreciate the idea that going to school these days sometimes is violent. I have so many cases of bullying that I see in the schools and outside the schools with social media now, that it sort of conditions people to be less sensitive to these issues. And then if we're less sensitive to them, and I include myself in this as a danger, we become less reactive to it. We set a stage for it so that it can have more of an expression.
I absolutely agree. The question is, where do we start? Because, okay, so we've diagnosed it. There is less empathy, and they've done studies and all of that. But again, our way of reacting or of responding is usually reacting. And we're not looking at the core issue. Like, we have to make societal changes. And people throw up their hands and say, oh, you can't change society. Well, we have changed it, usually by default.
Yes.
We can intentionally bring in those soft skills as opposed to computer skills,
Right.
And we seem to have thrown away the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
It's interesting, and this is kind of a non sequitur, but I speak in non sequiturs. They talked about, so the media latches onto schizophrenia.
Sure.
And they said the media latched onto the fact that the guy in Florida took steroids. Ergo, steroids causes violence, as opposed to all the people who didn't take steroids.
Right.
So they talked about how schizophrenia in the, let's say, mid-century was diagnosed as kind of a docile illness. And then in the 60s, 70s, the diagnosis was changed to violence. What's interesting about that is they've released these papers that the FBI then used to use against, Malcolm X, and so black leaders who were protesting political points of view, they could then just undermine that, dismiss it, and say he's mentally ill.
Right.
So that's the scary part about
It is.
the mental ill diagnosis.
Right. Yeah, it becomes a civil rights issue for sure, because you are right. People with mental illness, just in the fact that there are diagnoses that exist, certainly does not make them dangerous. You are right that most of the time that makes them more likely to be a victim. And the thing that's happening now is that those who are bantering mental illness as being the problem don't have the skill set to even be able to know what you just mentioned about schizophrenia. I treat patients with schizophrenia, and they certainly, as a whole, are not a group that I would even consider for this sort of thing.
Right.
But again, the movies frame a lot of ideas that people have about these things instead of real experience in that area.
Again, one of the reasons I'm happy to have this conversation with you is we have to talk to every segment of the population because everybody has some stake in it, and we all have to become stakeholders,
Yes.
conscious stakeholders. And so there is, like from your point of view of working with people with mental health issues, but looking at the overall problem of, lack of empathy. And there are things that we can become more active in bringing it into school systems. We tend to, again, just jump to, snippets of news, snippets of diagnosis. Let's do the quick fix. And really, we cause more damage.
Yes, we do.
And we live in a context of a violent society. And then, so people say, there are people who say, oh, yes, I watched a violent movie. Well, so did, 100 million other people, and they didn't all go out and kill somebody.
Right.
But again, if we start to explore it, why are we glamorizing violence? Why are we glamorizing? It does impact society. And why are we glamorizing, treating women like objects? We've done that for centuries.
Right.
So how are you going to fix this?
Oh, oh my goodness. How much time do we have? But I like the insinuation that you made in that there has to be a cultural change.
Yes.
It's gotten to a point where it's become obvious for anyone who really looks at the statistics and looks at the changes that we've had culturally. We don't care as much about each other. I remember growing up how common it was to be able to see someone in a parking lot, and they would catch your eye, and both people would even just give a brief smile and a hello. I measure that now when I'm out in the public. I keep a mental note of how often it happens. And I can confirm, anecdotally, of course, that in my experience, it just does not happen as much. We have so much more generalized paranoia in our culture, this idea that somehow if we open up, someone's going to take something from us.
Oh, I love that. I love that. I love that. It makes us vulnerable. Somebody's going to take something for us. And what's the mentality that has us live in fear of loss through contact? The truth is, I say hi to everybody. And people are responsive.
They are.
Because what happens is, if you live in that paranoia, you create your own reality because somebody's looking at you and you're thinking, oh, they're unfriendly. They're thinking, unfriendly, as opposed to, and of course you see what you're looking for.
That's
So
true.
it's, something as simple as, and I grew up, knowing all my neighbors and we're not
Me too.
necessarily going back to that, but we can create small communities inside of a city, inside of a workforce.
And there has to be a certain decorum that we expect of those who take the lead in our society. So public figures, we can't be allowing bullying going on, name calling. These sorts of things are very impacting to young people. They
Yes.
pay attention to these things. They see it, they copy it without even realizing
Yes.
that they are imitating it. And yet it continues to happen, and we have more of that going on now than what we ever have. It really does disenfranchise people.
Yes.
And I think that is the word that I keep coming back to when I think of school shootings, is the idea that that person, whoever is perpetrating that particular day, became so disenfranchised with not only their own life, but the lives of everyone surrounding them, that they were willing to do something that heinous. And one thing that everyone could notice if they really, really looked at these cases, no one seems to have an escape plan who perpetrate these
Right.
events, which brings in the whole thought of underlying suicidality.
Yes.
And suicide is up 24% since the turn of the century. which is a lot. In my world,
24% is
24%
huge. It's mind-boggling.
is huge. And people, we've been sort of conditioned to think of suicide as someone who's privately sitting in a room and contemplating how to end their life by themselves. But clearly today, that's not always the modus operandi of a person contemplating suicide. Sometimes, depending on how much frustration, how much disenfranchisement, how much feeling that I've been taken advantage of by society at large, sometimes you get that projected out in the form of a violent suicide.
Yeah.
And we see all the death and we focus on that, and rightly
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
but sometimes we forget what precipitated that.
It happened in some context, yes.
Yes.
And, for me, again, the whole, including the opioid and including all the ills of society, it starts with inclusivity.
Yes.
And what we keep doing is excluding. Okay, now we have another group to exclude, and now we have another, and it's them versus us.
Yeah.
And if we continue this way, we're going to destroy each other and ourselves.
Because even if it's not a volitional or calculated event,
Yes.
mistakes get made.
Mm-hmm.
And these can happen nationally, these can happen in communities, these can happen locally. It is almost a given event that eventually serious things will continue, will actually fall apart, that we've learned to count on over the years. So civility is an important quality that we're sort of
Wow.
complacent to right now.
That's really good. Yes,
Yeah.
it matters.
It does.
It counts for something.
It does.
And we don't address it very often.
Yeah, we don't, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So
So where do we start teaching that?
happens very, very early. I remember, and again, anecdotally, I have to go with my own experience,
Sure.
but I remember, say, with race relations, I remember the biggest impact for me growing up, this is going to be maybe funny, was watching Fat Albert, a cartoon, of course, created by Bill Cosby, but the whole idea of it was there were these black teenagers who were interacting with each other, African Americans who looked very much like me and my friends, talked very much like me and my friends, and had the same sort of conflicts as me and my friends. And it taught a very, very, very simple lesson, but one that was so poignant for me, is that it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. What matters is what you have inside. And it would make some people laugh that I just said that, because it sounds in today's culture
Hokey.
like, yeah, hokey. Oh, that's so silly. What are
Yeah.
you talking about?
Yeah.
But it really is that simple. And the same is true in
Yes.
this subject. Can we appreciate other individuals? Can we learn to see their strengths rather than their weaknesses?
Or even ignore their weaknesses.
Right,
You know?
exactly.
Again, we don't have to like everybody. We just have to treat each other civilly. And it's interesting. I've traveled around the world and lived in, faraway countries that most people don't go to. And the biggest lesson I came back with is we're all just human beings. I don't care what country you're in, what language you speak, all just human beings. And we are all connected. We have the opportunity to connect, and most people actually really, that's all they want.
It's true.
Invited into people's homes, treated like royalty, even in a simple peasant house, It's civility, it's respect for the other human being. And I think you're right in that, and again, I wish we were the answer king and queen, but we're not.
We will make our pronouncements today.
Yes. But it's this idea that our public figures are so lacking, and there are no heroes anymore, and we're okay with it, and we just accept it as the norm. Oh yeah, a scandal about so and so, and oh yeah, a scandal about so and so, and it has become the norm. And I think the way we have to do it is we actually, with our children, have to start in the home intentionally counteracting what's going on out there.
Yes.
Because when you walk out the door, you are not walking into a society that supports that.
Right.
So
I think
again,
that's huge, what you just said. I oftentimes, when I meet with parents, because I do have a large number of adolescent patients, and it even happens, of course, earlier than adolescence. But the fact that part of the role of being a parent is to be a teacher, and you must teach your children not for the world that you want for them, but the world that actually exists and how they can have a positive impact on the world. It's a tough chore, being a parent today.
Yes. But again, I think, and it may sound simplistic, but I just read something where celery juice alone can cure your stomach issues. Something
Who
as
knew?
simple as that. Yeah, who knew? So there are some simple answers.
There are.
We can train our teachers. We can do things like, and I see these things on YouTube and Facebook and whatever else. The children creating a bench where if you're feeling lonely, you go sit on a bench and somebody sees you on that bench, they immediately come over and say, "Oh, will you be my friend?"
Sure.
Children will eat that up.
Right.
All we have to do is teach it to them. But, we're so cold and callous and we think we overcomplicate things. All everybody really wants is to feel heard, seen, embraced, part of something.
Accepted.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I interviewed this, and I've mentioned this on other shows, but it was very compelling. I interviewed a former white supremacist who ran a hate line.
Okay.
And he's now the head of a group, Life After Hate.
Okay.
So, he had his childhood traumas and, all like we all do.
Yes.
And, but again, it's inside of a context of society. If you were having childhood traumas and society was more supportive, the impact might not be the same. So it's all about consciousness raising. But anyway, so he joined, angry teenager, blah, blah, blah. And he joined this hate group. And I said to him, was there anything anybody could have said to you along the way that would have woken you up? And he said, no, absolutely not. He said, because what it gave me was so powerful, identity and belonging.
Yeah.
So why do they have to go to a hate group for identity and belonging? And the thing that woke him up was having a child that he had to take care of. And it wasn't like suddenly he rejected all those principles. He just didn't have the time. And then actually, he went into therapy and he became a dad and he.
Sure.
Yeah. But again, identity and belonging. You want to be part of something. But we keep driving people away and to be part of something that is louder and more extreme, but not helpful.
The loudest gets the microphone.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
So we have a couple of minutes. What would you like to say?
Well, I think it's a great thing that people are, that we're talking about this today. I'm hoping that when people catch this show, that they think about these things. And I hope that in respect to, since this is what I do for a living, in respect to seeing your children and friends of yours at school, if there are any children watching, to know that there are people hurting out there. And hurt doesn't always look the same. Hurt is not always the person crying in the corner by themselves. Hurt sometimes can be that person who just pushed
Angry and push you
or threw something or broke something, and to try to exercise a level of empathy and understanding as to why that might be happening. And if you are a parent, to not take things for granted, to not be, it's very, very appealing to play something off. Well, he had a bad day. But to pay attention to all the communications and reach out. And it doesn't matter in the end who you reach out to, whether it's a psychiatrist, a therapist, a counselor, a life coach. It doesn't matter who has experience in that area, because it is about the rapport that's built. But do reach out. Whoever that is, reach out and get that person, whether it's a child, a friend, get the help that they need, or at least suggest to them, or spend the time talking with them. That would be a good start.
And the reality is we're all in this together. And we have one planet
this spinning orb
Yes.
that we have a limited time on, all of
Yes.
us.
And so it's, and again, people do reach out, but they may not be skilled at reaching out.
Right.
And so I want to add to that. If someone doesn't respond in the way you want to, reach out to somebody else.
Right.
There are enough people on the planet that if you keep reaching out, you'll find someone who will understand.
It's true.
Whether it's a professional, a neighbor, whatever. Yeah, it's just remembering that we are all in this together.
Yes, I agree.
Yes, so I think that's it.
I think so.
I'm happy you came on, and I think it's important for people just to start percolating and asking questions. It's not like there's one person who can find the solution. But if we're not asking the questions, and if we're not asking the right questions, and if we're not willing to be proactive, we're going to end up with what we have now, and then worse.
And then we have to suffer the unfortunate consequences of
Yes.
that without even having a say. It would
Yeah.
be nice to actually have a structured response rather
Yes.
than one that is reactive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on. It's
Thank
been
you.
great having this conversation with you.
Very nice spending this time with you,
Thank
Natasha.
you. My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.